The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom 4B of the Jefferson County Juvenile Court. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and the air felt heavy with tension. Marcus Johnson stood at the defendant's table, his thin frame looking even smaller in his neatly pressed but slightly oversized white shirt and black slacks that his grandmother had carefully ironed the night before. At 17, Marcus was tall for his age, but his hunched shoulders and downcast eyes made him appear much younger. His hands, clasped tightly in front of him, showed small calluses from his part-time job at the local grocery store. The only movement came from his right thumb, which slowly rubbed against his left palm, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. Judge Patricia Henderson sat high on her bench, peering down at Marcus through her rimless glasses. Her reputation for being tough on juvenile offenders was well known throughout the county. 20 years on the bench had left her with little patience for what she saw as teenage defiance, and the slight frown on her face deepened as she reviewed the case file before her. Case number 2025 GD 1123, State versus Marcus Johnson, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing in the nearly empty courtroom. Only a few people occupied the wooden benches. 2 law students observing proceedings, a tired-looking bailiff, and an elderly woman in a worn but clean floral dress. Marcus's grandmother, Mrs. Rose Johnson. Mr. Johnson, Judge Henderson's voice cut through the silence. You are charged with criminal trespassing, a Class B misdemeanor. You were found in the old Palmer Street Library building at 11:45 p.m. last Thursday. Do you understand these charges? Marcus's response was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. Speak up, young man. This is a courtroom, not a library. Judge Henderson's attempt at humor drew a small chuckle from the bailiff, but Mrs. Johnson's hands tightened around her worn leather purse. Yes, Your Honor, Marcus repeated, his voice slightly louder but still soft, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor just in front of the judge's bench. The public defender, Mr. James Chen, stood beside Marcus. He was young, probably in his first year of practice, and his suit looked as new as his law license. Your Honor, my client wishes to explain the circumstances of. Mr. Chen, Judge Henderson interrupted. I have a full docket today. What I see here is yet another young man who thinks rules don't apply to him. Breaking into buildings in the middle of the night? What were you doing there, Mr. Johnson? And look at me when I'm speaking to you. Marcus slowly raised his head, but his eyes seemed to look through rather than at the judge. His silence filled the courtroom like a physical presence. Nothing to say for yourself. Judge Henderson's voice took on an edge of frustration. This is exactly the problem with your generation. No respect for authority, no respect for property, no respect for. Your Honor, Mr. Chen tried again, if you would allow. Mr. Chen, you're new here, so let me explain how things work in my courtroom. When I see a young man who can't even bother to properly address this court, who breaks into buildings at night, who shows no remorse. In the gallery, Mrs. Johnson shifted in her seat, her arthritis-curved fingers clutching her purse tighter. The morning sun through the high windows cast shadows across her worried face, highlighting every line earned from raising first her children and now her grandson alone. Marcus remained still, his face a mask of calm that Judge Henderson interpreted as indifference. The only sign of his discomfort was the slightly faster movement of his thumb against his palm. The police report states you were found with books scattered around you. What were you doing? Planning to vandalize them. Sell them? This building has been closed for renovation for months. You've had no business being there. The silence that followed her question seemed to irritate Judge Henderson even more. She shuffled the papers before her, her silver reading glasses catching the fluorescent light. Well, nothing to say in your defense. No explanation for why a young man is breaking into buildings instead of preparing for his future. What Judge Henderson couldn't see, and what Marcus couldn't find the words to express in that moment, were the advanced physics textbooks in his backpack, the worn notebook filled with complex equations, or the early acceptance letter from MIT carefully folded in his grandmother's purse. These revelations would come later, but for now, Marcus stood silent, holding on to his dignity as the judge's assumptions filled the air around him. Judge Henderson's patience was running thin. 20 minutes had passed, and she still couldn't get more than a whispered response from the teenager standing before her. The morning sun now streamed fully through the tall courthouse windows, creating long shadows across the worn wooden floor of courtroom 4B. Mr. Johnson," she said, removing her glasses and placing them deliberately on her desk. "In my 30 years of legal experience, I've seen hundreds of young people stand exactly where you are now. Most of them at least try to defend themselves. Your silence tells me everything I need to know about your attitude." Marcus shifted slightly on his feet, but maintained his quiet demeanor. His public defender, Mr. Chen, noticed the teen's fingers twitching slightly at his sides, the only visible sign of his discomfort. "Perhaps you think this is all a joke?" Judge Henderson continued, her voice rising. "Breaking into buildings at night, disturbing property, and now showing complete disrespect for this court. Where do you see yourself in 5 years, young man? Or do you even think that far ahead?" In the gallery, Marcus's grandmother, Mrs. Rose Johnson, wanted to stand up and speak. She knew her grandson's brilliance, his quiet determination, his late nights studying by lamplight because they couldn't afford to run all the lights in their small apartment. But years of life experience had taught her when to wait, when to let truth reveal itself. The judge leaned forward over her bench. "Let me paint you a picture, Mr. Johnson. I see it every day. Young men like you, thinking the world owes them something. No respect for authority, no ambition, no direction. Is that what you want for your life?" Mr. Chen finally spoke up. "Your Honor, if I may." "No, Mr. Chen, I'm not finished." Judge Henderson stood up, adding to her already imposing presence. "You know what happens to young men who start like this? They come back to my courtroom again and again. Each time, the charges get more serious. Each time, they have another excuse. Each time, they waste more of their potential." The bailiff, who had seen countless similar lectures, stifled a yawn. The 2 law students in the back scribbled notes furiously, though one of them frowned slightly at the judge's tone. "Your school records show you've missed several days of classes this month," Judge Henderson continued, glancing at a paper in front of her. "Working hard at your education clearly isn't a priority. Instead, you're breaking into buildings in the middle of the night. Do you think colleges are looking for students with criminal records?" A small smile flickered across Marcus's face at the mention of colleges, but it disappeared so quickly that only Mr. Chen noticed it. The young lawyer's eyes narrowed as he glanced between his client and the file in his hands. "This behavior stops now," Judge Henderson declared, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "I'm tired of seeing bright young men throw their lives away. You could be studying, preparing for your future, making something of yourself. Instead, you're standing in my courtroom, acting like none of this matters." Marcus's silence had now stretched for so long that it had taken on a weight of its own. The judge interpreted it as defiance, the bailiff as guilt, but Mr. Chen was beginning to sense something else entirely. "Your Honor," Mr. Chen tried once more, "there are some important factors about my client's situation that—" "Facts?" Judge Henderson interrupted. "The facts are clear, Mr. Chen. Breaking and entering, trespassing, disturbing property, and now, complete disrespect for this court. What other facts could possibly excuse this behavior?" Just then, a paper slipped from Mr. Chen's overstuffed case file. As he bent to retrieve it, his eyes caught something that made him pause. It was a letter with a distinctive seal in the corner, one that would soon change the entire direction of this hearing. Marcus remained still, his eyes now focused on a point just above the judge's head. Years of dealing with assumptions and prejudices had taught him patience. He knew what was coming next, but he waited, letting the moment unfold as it always did before the truth emerged. Mrs. Johnson shifted in her seat, her weathered hands clutching an envelope in her purse, one that contained news that would soon silence every assumption being made in that courtroom. But for now, she watched as her grandson stood tall under the weight of judgment, knowing that sometimes the quietest voices carried the most powerful truths. Mr. Chen's hands trembled slightly as he held the newly discovered document. He cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and rose to his feet with newfound confidence. The fluorescent lights flickered once, as if sensing the moment was about to change. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stronger than before, "I believe there's something you need to see." He walked forward, holding out a stack of papers with official letterheads. "These are my client's academic records, which I just received this morning." Judge Henderson waved her hand dismissively. "Mr. Chen, we've already established that your client has multiple absences." "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Chen interrupted, earning a sharp look from the judge. Those absences were on Thursdays and Fridays, the days Marcus was attending advanced physics lectures at State University. A small murmur ran through the courtroom. The two law students in the back stopped their note-taking and looked up with sudden interest. Judge Henderson's eyebrows furrowed as she accepted the papers. "What exactly am I looking at, Mr. Chen?" "The first page is Marcus's current transcript. You'll notice his 4.0 GPA. The second page shows his SAT scores, perfect 1600. The third document," he paused, allowing a small smile, "is his early acceptance letter to MIT. Full scholarship." The silence in the courtroom took on a different quality now. Judge Henderson's reading glasses slipped slightly down her nose as she scanned the documents. Her mouth, which had been set in a stern line, slowly opened in surprise. "These scores? They can't be." She looked up at Marcus, who still stood quietly, though he had raised his eyes to meet hers for the first time. "The next page, Your Honor," Mr. Chen continued, "is a letter from Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to me, at State University's physics department. She explains that Marcus has been attending her quantum mechanics lectures as a special student. In fact, she's been mentoring him for the past year." The bailiff had given up any pretense of disinterest and was now leaning forward in his chair. Mrs. Johnson in the gallery sat straighter, pride replacing the worry on her face. "As for the trespassing charge," Mr. Chen pulled out another document. "This is a statement from the security guard who found Marcus that night. You discovered my client surrounded by advanced physics textbooks and notebooks filled with complex equations. Marcus was there because it's the only quiet place he could find to study after his work shift." Judge Henderson put down the papers and removed her glasses slowly. She looked at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. "Mr. Johnson," her voice had lost its sharp edge, "is this true? Why didn't you say anything?" Marcus spoke then, his voice soft but clear. "Yes, Your Honor. I apologize for being in the building. The lights were on, and the door was unlocked. I've been preparing for MIT's advanced placement exam, and sometimes," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes our apartment is too crowded for studying. My grandmother works nights as a nurse's aide, and I don't want to keep her awake during the day when she needs to rest." Mrs. Johnson wiped a tear from her eye as her grandson spoke about their circumstances without shame or self-pity. "The library where I usually study closes at 9, Marcus continued. "I work at Fuller's Grocery until 10, and I need at least 3 hours of study time to keep up with Dr. Chen's assignments. When I saw the lights on in the old library," he shrugged slightly, "I made a poor choice. I'm sorry." Judge Henderson shuffled through the papers again, lingering on a particular page. "This paper, it says you've already published research?" Mr. Chen nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Marcus is the youngest co-author ever published in the Journal of Quantum Physics. He developed a new theoretical approach to quantum entanglement. Dr. Chen says it's revolutionary." The judge looked down at her earlier notes, where she had written "typical teenage delinquent" in her sharp handwriting. She slowly drew a line through those words, the scratch of her pen audible in the silent courtroom. The morning sun had shifted now, casting a warm glow directly on Marcus. He stood in that light, no longer hunched but straight and dignified, his quiet demeanor now reading as something very different from what the judge had initially assumed. The truth of who he was had finally filled the courtroom, displacing all the earlier judgments and assumptions that had clouded the air. The mood in courtroom 4B had shifted dramatically. Judge Henderson, who had moments ago been lecturing about wasted potential, now leaned forward with genuine interest as Mr. Chen began sharing more details about his client's remarkable story. "Your Honor," Mr. Chen said, pulling out another document from his file, "with the court's permission, I'd like to provide some context about Marcus's background." Mrs. Johnson rose slowly from her seat in the gallery, her nurse's aide uniform crisp despite having just finished her night shift. "May I speak, Your Honor?" Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the same quiet dignity as her grandson's. Judge Henderson nodded, still looking somewhat stunned by the earlier revelations. "Please, Mrs. Johnson, the court would like to hear from you." As Marcus's grandmother made her way to the front, she pulled a worn photo from her purse. "This was taken 2 years ago," she said, handing it to Mr. Chen, who passed it to the judge. The photo showed Marcus surrounded by middle school students, pointing at a handmade science project. Marcus started tutoring younger children in math and science when he was 15, Mrs. Johnson explained. He never asked for payment. These children's parents work the same late shifts I do at the hospital. They can't afford private tutors. The judge studied the photo, noting the same quiet smile on Marcus's face that she now recognized as thoughtful rather than defiant. After my daughter, Marcus's mother, passed away from cancer 5 years ago, Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice steady despite the pain of the memory. Marcus threw himself into his studies. He said understanding physics might help him understand why things happen the way they do. Mr. Chen stepped forward with another document. This is Marcus's work schedule from Fuller's Grocery, Your Honor. He works 30 hours a week, always taking the late shift so he can attend school and the university lectures during the day. The late shift? Judge Henderson asked, looking at Marcus. And you still maintain these grades? Marcus nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Fuller lets me study during slow periods. Sometimes I solve equations while stocking shelves. A small smile crossed his face. Physics problems are actually easier to solve while moving. It helps me think. The bailiff, who had been listening intently, couldn't suppress a chuckle at this. Even Judge Henderson's stern expression softened slightly. Your Honor, Mr. Chen continued, Marcus's daily schedule is quite remarkable. He wakes up at 5 a.m. to help his grandmother after her night shift. He attends high school from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., then goes to quantum physics lectures at State University until 5 p.m. He works at Fuller's from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., and then, he paused, looking at his client. And then I study. Marcus finished quietly, usually until about 2 a.m. 4 hours of sleep? Judge Henderson asked, concern replacing her earlier skepticism. How long have you been keeping this schedule? Since sophomore year, Marcus replied. After Mom died, Grandma had to take extra shifts. The hospital doesn't pay nurses' aides very well. I wanted to help. Mrs. Johnson reached for her grandson's hand. I told him to quit the job, focus on school. But he's stubborn, just like his mother was. He kept saying we're a team. The law students in the back of the courtroom had stopped taking notes, completely absorbed in the story unfolding before them. One wiped away a tear discreetly. The night I was found in the old library, Marcus explained, his voice growing stronger, I had just finished a breakthrough in my research. Dr. Chen had challenged me to find a new approach to quantum entanglement theory. I couldn't wait until morning to work on it, and the lights were on in the building. Those lights, the bailiff suddenly spoke up. They've been having electrical issues during renovation. Sometimes they come on by themselves at night. Judge Henderson looked at the pile of documents before her, the perfect test scores, the MIT acceptance, the published research paper, the work schedule, and the photo of Marcus teaching children. Each piece revealed another layer of a story she had completely misjudged. Mr. Johnson, she said, her tone now carrying respect rather than criticism, I believe we need to hear the full story of how you became interested in quantum physics. And perhaps, she added with a hint of humility in her voice, why you choose to remain so quiet despite your extraordinary achievements. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked past 10:30 a.m. as Judge Henderson removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. The morning had not gone as she had expected. The supposedly defiant teenager before her had turned out to be something entirely different. And for the first time in years, she felt genuinely humbled on the bench. Ms. Roberts, she called to the prosecuting attorney who had been silent throughout the revelations. What is the state's position on this case? Sarah Roberts stood up, straightening her navy blazer. She looked down at her case file, then closed it deliberately. Your Honor, in light of the circumstances revealed here today, the state wishes to withdraw all charges against Mr. Johnson. A small sigh of relief escaped from Mrs. Johnson in the gallery. Marcus remained still, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. Furthermore, Ms. Roberts continued, her voice carrying unexpected emotion, I would like to apologize to Mr. Johnson. Had we known the full circumstances, she paused, then turned to face Marcus directly. The old Palmer Street Library was my favorite study spot when I was in law school. I understand why you chose it. Judge Henderson leaned forward, her earlier sternness replaced by genuine curiosity. Mr. Johnson, you mentioned your research on quantum entanglement. Would you explain it to the court? In simple terms, if possible. For the first time that morning, Marcus's face lit up with real enthusiasm. His voice, though still quiet, carried a new confidence. Quantum entanglement is when two particles become connected in such a way that the state of one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. He took a small step forward, warming to his subject. My research suggests a new way to maintain these connections over longer distances. If it works, it could help make quantum computers more practical, maybe even lead to better encryption for protecting data. The judge nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. And you developed this theory while stocking shelves at Fuller's grocery? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus replied, returning her slight smile. The repetitive motion helps me think. Mr. Fuller lets me write equations on the backs of old receipts. The two law students in the back of the courtroom exchanged impressed looks. Even the bailiff had pulled out his phone, quietly Googling quantum entanglement. Judge Henderson stood up, her black robe rustling in the quiet courtroom. Mr. Johnson, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you that were not only wrong but unfair. Your silence, which I mistook for disrespect, was actually dignity in the face of prejudice. She looked down at her notes, where she had earlier written such harsh judgments. Too often, we in the justice system see what we expect to see. We let our preconceptions blind us to the truth, standing right in front of us. Marcus nodded slightly, accepting her words without bitterness. Mrs. Johnson wiped a tear from her eye as Mr. Chen gathered his papers with a satisfied smile. However, the judge continued, her tone becoming warmer. We now have an opportunity to right this wrong. Ms. Roberts has moved to dismiss the charges, and I fully agree. But I'd like to do more. She turned to her clerk. Please contact Dr. Williams at the City Science Center. Tell them I'm calling in that favor he owes me. Looking back at Marcus, she explained, the Science Center has private study rooms that are open 24 hours. Dr. Williams can arrange for you to have full access. No more studying in closed buildings. Marcus's eyes widened in surprise. Thank you, Your Honor. Additionally, Judge Henderson continued, I sit on the board of the Thompson Educational Foundation. We have a program that provides stipends to promising students so they can reduce their work hours and focus on their studies. She looked at Mrs. Johnson. This would help make up for the lost income if Marcus cuts back at Fuller's. Mrs. Johnson pressed her hands together. Two moved to speak. Marcus reached out to steady his grandmother, his own eyes bright with unexpected tears. Sometimes, Judge Henderson said, addressing the entire courtroom, our greatest error is not in making a mistake, but in failing to recognize the extraordinary individuals who come before us. Mr. Johnson, this court owes you more than an apology. We owe you the support and resources you've earned through your dedication and brilliance. After the formal dismissal of charges, Judge Henderson asked everyone except Marcus, his grandmother, Mr. Chen, and Ms. Roberts to leave the courtroom. The bailiff closed the heavy wooden doors behind him, leaving the small group in a more intimate setting. Please, everyone, come closer, Judge Henderson said, stepping down from her bench for the first time that morning. She gestured to the conference table usually used by attorneys. Let's talk about your future, Mr. Johnson. They'd all sat down, the formal atmosphere of the courtroom dissolving into something more collaborative. Marcus found himself seated directly across from the judge who, just an hour ago, had been ready to punish him. I've made some calls during our brief recess, Judge Henderson began, pulling out her phone to check her notes. Dr. Williams from the Science Center is already preparing your access card. You'll have a private study room on the 3rd floor with a view of the city. Marcus's eyes widened. He had walked past the Science Center many times, admiring the modern building with its floor-to-ceiling windows and state-of-the-art facilities. That's very generous, Your Honor. It gets better, she continued, a smile warming her usually stern face. Dr. Williams mentioned that the center has a summer internship program for gifted students. He'd like you to apply. Actually, she corrected herself with a small laugh. He insisted you apply. Mrs. Johnson reached for her grandson's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. Her entire body seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Ms. Roberts, who had been checking her own phone, looked up. Your Honor, if I may. At the judge's nod, she continued, I just spoke with my brother. He runs the mentorship program at Tech Industries. They're always looking for young minds interested in quantum computing. If Marcus would like, they could arrange some time with their research team. That would be amazing, Marcus said softly, his voice carrying a hint of excitement he couldn't quite suppress. They're doing groundbreaking work in quantum processor development. You know their work? Ms. Roberts asked, impressed. I've read all their published papers, Marcus replied. Dr. Zhang's approach to reducing decoherence in quantum bits is brilliant. Judge Henderson watched this exchange with growing satisfaction. Mr. Chen, she turned to the public defender, you've been quiet. Any thoughts? The young lawyer smiled. Actually, yes. My old professor at State University runs a pre-college summer program. Given Marcus's circumstances, I'm sure we could arrange full scholarship coverage. That reminds me, the judge added, pulling out a business card from her wallet. This is the contact information for James Thompson himself, of the Thompson Educational Foundation. I spoke with him briefly during the recess. He's very interested in your research. The foundation doesn't usually grant stipends to high school students, but he's willing to make an exception. Mrs. Johnson's eyes filled with tears. This would mean Marcus wouldn't have to work so many hours at the grocery store. Exactly, Judge Henderson confirmed. The stipend would more than cover what he makes at Fuller's. You could focus on your studies, Marcus, and still help your grandmother. Marcus sat quietly, processing all these sudden opportunities. His fingers moved slightly, as if working through complex equations in his mind. There's one more thing, the judge said, her voice becoming gentle. The old Palmer Street Library, it's being renovated for a reason. The city is turning it into a community learning center with extended hours specifically for students who need a quiet place to study. Would you be interested in being part of the planning committee? We could use someone who understands exactly why such a space is needed. For the first time that morning, Marcus's smile reached his eyes. I would be honored, Your Honor. Good, Judge Henderson said firmly. Sometimes, Mr. Johnson, what looks like an ending can become a beginning. Your story, your dedication, your brilliance, your quiet persistence, it needs to be heard. Not just for you, but for all the other young people who might be sitting where you sat today, being judged before they can reveal their true potential. Mr. Chen began writing down contact information and next steps. Ms. Roberts called her brother to set up a meeting with the research team, and Mrs. Johnson watched it all with growing amazement, her hand still holding her grandson's under the table, her faith in justice quietly restored. News travels fast in a small city, and Marcus Johnson's story spread even faster. Within a week of his court appearance, local news stations picked up the story of the quiet genius who had been studying quantum physics in an abandoned library. But it wasn't just the media that took notice, the story sparked real change in the community. Principal Roberts of Eastside High School called an emergency staff meeting after reading about his student in the morning paper. How did we miss this? He asked his assembled teachers. We had a published physicist sitting in our classrooms, and most of us didn't even know it. Miss Martinez, Marcus's physics teacher, stood up. Marcus tried to tell me about his quantum research once, she admitted, her voice heavy with regret. I thought he was just repeating something he read online. I didn't even look at his equations. In the back of the room, Mr. Thompson, the school counselor, was already making plans. We need to change how we evaluate quiet students, he said. Being silent doesn't mean being disengaged. Sometimes the quietest students are thinking the deepest thoughts. Across town at Fuller's grocery, Mr. Fuller posted Marcus's story on the employee bulletin board. He'd added a personal note. Proud to have a genius on our night shift. And yes, those equations on the back of old receipts are now framed in my office. The story reached Dr. Lisa Chen at State University's physics department, who immediately called a colleague at MIT. You're getting someone special, she said. But more importantly, we need to talk about making our lectures more accessible to high school students. Marcus can't be the only one out there with this kind of potential. At the courthouse, Judge Henderson's change of heart had the biggest ripple effect. She called a meeting with other juvenile court judges from the district. We need to look deeper, she told them, sharing Marcus's case file. Every young person who comes before us has a story. We need to listen before we judge. The impact spread to the city council, where members were discussing the budget for the coming year. The old Palmer Street Library renovation project, which had been moving slowly due to funding issues, suddenly became a priority. If one student could develop groundbreaking physics theories in a closed building, Councilwoman Martinez argued, imagine what our young people could do with proper facilities and support. The council voted to fast-track the renovation, adding plans for extended hours and dedicated study spaces. They named one of the private study rooms the Johnson Room, complete with a whiteboard wall for equations. Local business leaders took notice too. Sarah Chen, CEO of Tech Solutions, announced a new scholarship program for students interested in science and technology. Marcus Johnson reminded us that brilliance doesn't always come in obvious packages, she said at the press conference. We need to look harder for the quiet geniuses in our community. Back at East Side High, something remarkable was happening. Students who had always been shy about their interests in science and math started speaking up. Jeremy Torres, a quiet sophomore, finally showed his teachers the robot he'd been building in his garage. Maria Rodriguez revealed her complex climate change models that she'd been working on alone for months. Marcus showed us it's okay to be different, Jeremy said during a school newspaper interview. You don't have to be loud to be heard. The story even reached neighboring cities. Judge Henderson started receiving calls from other jurisdictions, asking about implementing similar changes in their juvenile court systems. Before you pass judgment, she told them, ask yourself, could there be another Marcus Johnson sitting before you? Mrs. Johnson watched all of this unfold with quiet pride. One evening, as she prepared for her night shift at the hospital, she found a note from her grandson. It read, Grandma, my quantum physics research is about how particles can be connected across any distance. But you taught me that people can be connected too when we take the time to understand each other. The note made her smile. She'd seen more changes in the past week than she had in years. The hospital administrator had approved new study spaces for employees' children. The Nurses' Aid program was being reevaluated to include better pay and education benefits. Even her neighbors looked at her differently now, not with pity for her hard circumstances, but with respect for raising such a remarkable grandson. Marcus's story had become more than just a tale of mistaken judgment. It had become a catalyst for change, reminding an entire community that potential can be found in unexpected places and that sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning in courtroom 4B. The same room now looked very different, filled with eager young faces and camera crews from local news stations. Judge Henderson stood at her bench, but today she wore a warm smile instead of her usual stern expression. Welcome to the first meeting of the Youth Mentorship Program, she announced, looking out at the crowd. And I can think of no better person to launch this initiative than our keynote speaker, Mr. Marcus Johnson. Marcus walked to the podium, no longer the hunched, quiet teenager who had stood there half a year ago. He still moved with the same careful precision, but now his head was held high, his voice clear and steady as he addressed the audience. 6 months ago, I stood in this room expecting the worst, he began. Instead, I found understanding. But more importantly, I learned that being quiet doesn't mean being powerless. In the front row, Mrs. Johnson sat proudly, wearing a new dress instead of her nurse's aide uniform. Thanks to the Thompson Educational Foundation's support, she had been able to reduce her work hours and enroll in a nursing degree program herself. Many of you know my story, Marcus continued, gesturing to the newly renovated courtroom, which now doubled as a meeting space for youth programs. But today, I want to talk about what happened after. He clicked a button, and the large screen behind him lit up with images. The first showed the new study center at the old Palmer Street Library, its walls covered with whiteboards filled with equations and ideas. This is where 30 students now study every night, he explained. They don't have to break in like I did. A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. They'd have proper desks, good lighting, and mentors who understand that some dreams don't fit into regular business hours. The next slide showed Marcus with Dr. Zhang's research team at Tech Industries, working on quantum computing projects. Thanks to Ms. Roberts and her brother, I've been able to contribute to real-world applications of quantum theory. Our team just submitted a paper on quantum encryption that could help make digital communications more secure. Judge Henderson nodded approvingly. She had already seen their work featured in scientific journals, though she still couldn't understand most of the mathematics involved. But the most important change, Marcus said, switching to a photo of Eastside High School's new late-night study program, is happening right here in our community. 25 students who used to hide their talents are now getting the support they need. They don't have to choose between helping their families and pursuing their dreams. In the audience, Mr. Fuller from the grocery store watched proudly. He had started a flexible scheduling program for student workers, ensuring they had enough time for both work and study. 3 of his young employees were now applying to college. Success shouldn't depend on being lucky enough to get caught studying in the wrong place at the right time, Marcus continued, earning another wave of gentle laughter. It should come from having the right support from the beginning. He turned to Judge Henderson. Your Honor, you could have just seen another case filed that morning. Instead, you chose to look deeper. That choice didn't just change my life. It started a chain reaction that's still growing. The judge dabbed at her eyes discreetly as Marcus showed the final slide. A group photo of the first class of student mentors, including himself, who would help guide other young people through the legal system. Today, as I prepare to leave for NIT next month, I'm not just carrying my own dreams, Marcus concluded. I'm carrying the hope that every quiet kid with big ideas will find their voice, that every judge will look past first impressions, that every community will learn to listen before they judge. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. In quantum physics, we study how the smallest particles can have the biggest impacts. The same is true in life. Small changes, a moment of understanding, a word of encouragement, a second chance, can transform entire communities. As Marcus finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. Judge Henderson rose from her bench, but not to pass judgment this time. Instead, she joined the standing ovation for the young man who had taught her court its most valuable lesson. In the back of the room, 2 new law students scribbled notes, just as their predecessors had done 6 months ago. But this time, they weren't recording legal precedents. They were writing down ideas for change, inspired by a quiet genius who had shown them that justice works best when it comes with understanding.